June 15, 1944, Iwo Jima Strait. The morning air over the Pacific is thin and clear. At 30,000 feet, the sun turns the ocean below into a sheet of blinding silver. Two Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0s climb steadily, engines straining, wings trembling from the effort. Their pilots squint upward, and then they see it, a shape gliding far above them, smooth, vast, unreachable. The bomber's skin gleams like polished chrome, its four massive engines humming in perfect harmony. The formation stretches across the sky like a fleet of flying ships, calm, deliberate, untouchable. The Japanese pilots laugh through their oxygen masks. They think it's arrogance, that the Americans have built something too big, too heavy to fight. But the laughter fades as they pull their throttles forward and realize their Zeros can climb no higher. The stranger in the sky drifts on, beyond reach, beyond comprehension. Below, the islands wait. And above them, the era of the B-29 has just begun. In the early years of the Pacific War, air power was still learning what it meant to reach across an ocean. Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to New Guinea, its Zero fighters ruling the skies with deadly agility. For the United States, every mile toward Tokyo was an impossible distance, one measured not only in geography, but in fuel, steel, and human endurance. In 1942, the Doolittle raid had given America its first symbolic strike on Japan. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the deck of the USS Hornet, thundered toward Tokyo in an act of pure defiance. They hit their targets, but the mission was never meant to cripple, only to prove Japan was not untouchable. Every aircraft ran out of fuel. Every crew either crash-landed or bailed out over China. It was a gesture of courage, not strategy. And for Japan, it only strengthened the illusion of superiority. By 1943, that illusion began to crack. The U.S. Navy's island-hopping campaign advanced across the Pacific step by step, reclaiming airfields and seaways. But the idea of bombing Japan directly, of bringing the war home to its city, still felt impossible. No existing aircraft could reach Tokyo from any American base and return. The older bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, were already legends over Europe. But the Pacific was another kind of battlefield. Here the distances were vast, the weather merciless, and the enemy dispersed over thousands of miles of ocean. Japan's own air defenses thrived on proximity, small fighters defending nearby bases, intercepting threats quickly, then retreating. The Zero, with its light frame and unmatched maneuverability, dominated at low and medium altitudes. But it was fragile, with no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a limited ceiling. For now that weakness didn't matter. The enemy couldn't reach high enough to expose it. Inside the U.S. Army Air Forces, however, a new vision was forming. General Hap Arnold, commander of the USAAF, understood that technology, not bravery, would decide the next phase of war. He wanted an aircraft that could bomb Japan from bases thousands of miles away. It needed to fly higher, faster, and farther than anything ever built. A bomber that could carry 5 tons of explosives over the Pacific, survive enemy fire, and come back home. The vision sounded absurd, a fantasy of engineers. But the war demanded absurd solutions. In 1939, before the United States even entered the conflict, a request went out to Boeing, Consolidated, and Douglas. The Army wanted an aircraft capable of crossing oceans. The result, from Boeing's workshops in Seattle, was something no one had seen before: the Model 345 prototype. It would later be known as the B-29 Superfortress. At first, it was just an idea on blueprints, a collection of promises written in aluminum and fuel. But those blueprints held the key to something revolutionary: pressurized cabins for high-altitude flight, remote-controlled gun turrets operated by analog computers, and engines powerful enough to lift the heaviest payloads in history. The cost would be staggering, more than $3 billion by the end of the war, greater than the cost of the Manhattan Project itself. But for Arnold and his planners, this was the weapon that would finally reach the Japanese homeland. In the skies over the Pacific, Japanese pilots laughed at the rumors. They heard whispers of an invisible bomber that could fly beyond their reach. Propaganda, they thought. No machine could climb higher than a Zero's limit, at least none that could still carry bombs. They didn't know that in secret hangars across America, the future of aerial warfare was already taking shape, and soon, the laughter would stop. By 1943, America's war machine had become a storm of industry. Steel, rubber, oil, and manpower flowed through endless factories, a rhythm of hammers, presses, and dreams of dominance. Amid that noise, in the quiet airfields of Wichita, Kansas, and Seattle, Washington, the B-29 Superfortress was being born. It was the most advanced aircraft of its age, and the most temperamental. Each one contained over 55,000 separate parts. It could cruise above 30,000 feet, where thin air made enemy interception nearly impossible. Its Wright R-3350 engines were among the most powerful ever built, and also the most dangerous, prone to catching fire mid-flight. To operate this machine required precision, courage, and a touch of madness. Crews nicknamed it the Beast. Test pilots fought through endless mechanical failures, overheating cylinders, oil leaks, and controls that froze in the cold stratosphere. Some prototypes never made it back to the runway, but every crash was a lesson, every problem a step closer to the future. At Boeing's test fields, engineers introduced innovations that seemed like science fiction. The pressurized cabin meant that crews could fly comfortably at altitudes where oxygen masks once froze to the skin. A central analog computer allowed gunners to control multiple remote turrets with perfect accuracy. Even the design of its bomb bay doors, lightweight, fast-opening clamshells, shaved seconds off release time at high speed. It wasn't just a bomber. It was the first step toward the jet age. In early 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces assembled a top-secret unit, the 20th Air Force. Its mission, to use the B-29 to strike the Japanese home islands. At its head stood General Hap Arnold himself. For him, the B-29 wasn't just another weapon. It was his legacy. The aircraft that would prove strategic bombing could end wars. But there was a problem. No American base lay within striking distance of Japan. To use the Superfortress, the U.S. needed airfields in China, thousands of miles across mountains and jungle. Thus began Operation Matterhorn, an enormous logistical effort to establish forward bases in Chengdu. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every bullet had to be flown in over the hump, the treacherous air route across the Himalayas. It took 6 gallons of fuel just to deliver 1 gallon for a combat mission. But still, they flew. The world's most advanced bomber was now based on the edge of the enemy's empire. The first B-29 raids on Japan began in June 1944, targeting the Yawata steelworks on Kyushu. The mission was symbolic, not decisive, a test of reach and will. Half the aircraft failed to reach the target. Engines overheated. Bombs fell off target. The Japanese watched in disbelief as these giant silver machines crawled across the sky at unreachable altitudes. Their pilots scoffed. This was no weapon of terror, only an expensive spectacle. And yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time, Japan's home islands had been struck by aircraft operating directly from Allied-controlled bases. For the first time, the war had crossed the ocean not through ships but through the air. The Superfortress had revealed itself. Flawed, yes, but unstoppable. Even in its failures, it terrified Japan's leadership. Intelligence officers called it the enemy's fortress in the clouds. They began developing new interceptors, the Ki-44 and Ki-84, to reach its altitude, but few could match the B-29's climb or endurance. Then, in late 1944, a new chapter began. The capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, brought Japan within direct range of the B-29. Now the bombers no longer needed China's fragile supply lines. From these Pacific islands, they could strike Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe, and return the same night. As the first bombers taxied down Tinian's runways, their engines thundered across the sea. The Japanese pilots, who once laughed at the idea of a super bomber, would soon watch their cities vanish in clouds of fire. The age of invincibility was over. The age of destruction had begun. War in the air had always been a contest of nerves. By 1944, it had become a contest of endurance, between men strapped into machines that barely obeyed them, fighting enemies they rarely saw. The B-29 was a miracle of engineering, but it demanded superhuman discipline to control. The human angle, the crew of the fortress, inside its pressurized hull, 11 men shared the sky. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners. each confined to narrow compartments connected by a thin tunnel over the bomb bays. The air outside was 60 degrees below freezing. Inside, the smell of oil, sweat, and heated metal filled the cabin. Every mission began the same way. The long, slow taxi down coral runways, the engines screaming like beasts straining at their chains. Takeoff consumed almost the entire strip. A B-29 heavy with bombs could barely climb, and if one engine failed, the crew's fate was sealed before the mission even began. They trained endlessly, learning to trust their instruments, their fire control computers, and each other. But no amount of training could prepare them for what lay ahead. Hours of lonely flight over the endless ocean, then into the furnace of anti-aircraft fire above Japan. Each man knew that even if he survived the bombs, the return flight might not be possible. Still they flew, believing that every mission shortened the war. They wrote letters to families back home, sometimes leaving them in lockers before takeoff. Many never returned to claim them. The tactical angle, the defenders below them, Japan's air defense network braced for a new kind of war. Until the B-29, no enemy aircraft had ever reached Japan in daylight with impunity. The Zero, the pride of Japanese aviation, had ruled the skies since Pearl Harbor, but it was built for agility, not altitude. At 30,000 feet, it gasped for air. Its guns froze. Its engine lost power. Radar stations along the coast began detecting high-altitude intruders, too high for conventional interceptors. Commanders scrambled the fastest fighters available, but they climbed too slowly to catch the bombers before they turned home. Ground-based flak burst harmlessly thousands of feet below the B-29s. The Japanese called them invincible. Pilots reported their frustration in terse after-action notes. Could not intercept. Enemy above effective ceiling. One described them as silver whales that float beyond reach. It was not just a tactical problem, it was a blow to national pride. The empire that had once dominated the Pacific was now helpless beneath its own sky. The technological angle, a machine. Ahead of its time, the B-29 wasn't simply a bigger bomber. It was a different species. Its systems were electric, hydraulic, and digital in ways that would shape aviation for decades. Its analog computer, the Central Fire Control System, used gyroscopes and electrical sighting to calculate bullet trajectories automatically. For the first time, a gunner could shoot down a fighter he never even saw. Pressurization allowed crews to fly at altitudes that would have frozen men in earlier aircraft. The bomber's range stretched over 3,000 miles, its payload up to 20,000 pounds. It was more than a machine. It was a mobile ecosystem of precision and power. But all of that came at a price. The Wright R-3350 engines, rushed into production under wartime pressure, were infamous for their volatility. If cooling flaps jammed or oil lines leaked, flames could engulf the nacelles in seconds. Crews developed grim jokes. If the flak doesn't get you, the engines will. Maintenance teams worked through the night, covered in grease and fuel, fighting to keep these mechanical giants alive, and yet, when the B-29s lifted into the thin blue, they were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Fast, elegant, and utterly terrifying to those below. The emotional sky for the Japanese population, the sound of distant engines became the sound of dread. The first raids had been scattered and inaccurate, but each one carried a psychological weight greater than the bombs themselves. They revealed the truth. Japan's borders could no longer protect its heartland. Children practiced air drills in schoolyards. Families dug makeshift shelters in their gardens. Newspapers described the B-29 as a ghost in the clouds. Officials urged calm, but panic crept in quietly, like smoke before the firestorm. For the men inside those bombers, fear worked in silence. They couldn't see the people below, only the glow of cities and the flash of anti-aircraft bursts. Some tried to convince themselves they were hitting military targets. Others knew better. They saw towns and neighborhoods spread out like constellations before the bombs fell. Each city another mark on the map, each raid another entry in a ledger of destruction. The B-29 was both a masterpiece and a moral riddle, a triumph of engineering, and a reminder that progress often walked hand in hand with devastation. As 1944 closed, both sides stared into the same sky, one with awe, the other with disbelief. But beneath that silence, a storm was gathering. Because one man, deep within the 20th Air Force Command, was about to change everything, not with invention, but with fire. The leadership angle, Curtis LeMay and the War of Fire. When General Curtis LeMay arrived in the Pacific, he was only 38 years old, calm-faced, cigar in hand, already known for one thing: results. He had commanded bomber groups in Europe, perfecting formation tactics and precision targeting under fire. Now he faced a different war, one fought across an ocean, against an enemy that refused to surrender. LeMay studied the reports from the B-29 raids over Japan. Bombs missed targets by miles, engines overheated, wind scattered formations, and radar failed over cloud-covered islands. The superfortress was a marvel, but it wasn't delivering victory. He made a decision few could have imagined. If precision bombing couldn't break Japan, then fire would. He ordered the bombers stripped of their defensive guns to save weight. He instructed crews to fly low, barely 5,000 to 7,000 feet, where Japanese radar couldn't track them effectively. And instead of high-explosive ordnance, he loaded their bomb bays with incendiaries. It was a complete reversal of doctrine. No more surgical strikes on factories. Now the target was everything that burned. The homes, the workshops, the heart of Japan's cities. Many of his subordinates doubted him. Flying low over enemy territory without guns was suicide. But LeMay was unmoved. He believed that war had to be ended as fast as possible, no matter the cost. And the B-29, the world's most advanced bomber, was about to become the weapon of mass destruction it was designed to be. The enemy perspective. From arrogance to awe for Japanese fighter pilots, the first encounters with the B-29 were surreal. They had spent years mastering dogfighting in agile aircraft. The Zero, the Ki-43, the Ki-61. Now they faced something they could barely reach. They rose into the sky with oxygen masks tight, engines screaming, only to see the enemy recede into the thin blue, beyond the reach of their guns. When they did manage to climb high enough, their bullets glanced off the bomber's armor like rain. The B-29s flew in disciplined boxes, their remote-controlled turrets locking onto any approaching fighter with deadly precision. One Japanese ace described it later. "We had fought men before." The B-29 was not a man. It was a fortress that killed without mercy. As the raids intensified, the tone in Japanese reports shifted. From mockery, "The American elephants cannot fly far," to despair. "They come every night. We cannot stop them." Anti-aircraft gunners aimed blindly into the sky, shells bursting far below the glowing trails of the bombers. By the end of 1944, entire airfields were redeployed around Tokyo just to catch a few of them. It was a futile defense. The Empire's finest pilots died chasing shadows. The moral angle, fire as strategy, strategic bombing had begun as an idea of precision to hit the enemy's capacity to fight while sparing civilians. But Japan's war economy blurred every line. Homes doubled as workshops. Schoolchildren built aircraft parts. Women made uniforms in their kitchens. Destroying Japan's ability to fight meant destroying its cities. LeMay's plan didn't disguise that truth. He accepted it. He once said, "If we lose, I'll be tried as a war criminal." But he also believed that his campaign would save more lives in the long run by ending the war months sooner, before an invasion of Japan became necessary. When he ordered the first mass incendiary raid, his subordinates hesitated. They knew what napalm and magnesium could do to wooden cities, but LeMay saw no alternative. Every night that the war continued, thousands more died across Asia. It was brutal arithmetic, and the B-29 was its instrument. The technological counterpoint, Japan's desperate response. Japan's engineers scrambled to counter the superfortress. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate was developed as a high-altitude interceptor, fast and powerful. But production shortages left only a handful operational. Others experimented with desperate tactics, ramming attacks, night intercepts, even specialized fire balloons carried by the jet stream toward America. None made a dent in the B-29's momentum. Radar systems, still primitive compared to Allied technology, struggled to detect incoming raids. Fuel shortages crippled pilot training. By 1945, Japan's air defense network was collapsing under its own exhaustion. The once proud Imperial Japanese Army Air Service was reduced to a reactive force, fighting shadows in the dark. The psychological angle. The sky as a living thing to the Japanese people. The sky itself had become a presence, an ominous, waiting thing. When sirens wailed, families gathered what they could: a bucket of water, a single blanket, a photograph of ancestors. They ran to rivers, open fields, or underground stations, praying the bombs would fall elsewhere. And yet there was an eerie fatalism in the air. Many citizens believed the Americans could not possibly destroy every city, that the gods would intervene, that Japan's spirit would endure. They didn't yet know that the true war of fire had not even begun. For the men of the 20th Air Force, that same sky felt like both protection and prison. They flew above the clouds, detached from the horror below, but not immune to its weight. Some wrote later that they could smell the smoke through the cabin filters, that even at 30,000 feet the scent of burning cities reached them. It was not triumph. It was transformation. The moment when technology, leadership, and desperation fused into something far beyond human control. And in March 1945, all those forces would converge over one city, Tokyo. The B-29s would descend, not from the heavens, but from history itself, carrying a new kind of weapon, fire that burned the night sky until it glowed like dawn. Tokyo, March 9, 1945. Midnight approached, and the sky over Japan's capital was moonless, a dark canvas stretched above a city of paper and wood. 3 million people slept in narrow houses stacked side by side, the air heavy with the scent of rice smoke and spring rain. They did not know that, hundreds of miles to the south, the largest armada of bombers in human history had already lifted off. From airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, 334 B-29. Superfortresses rumbled into the night. Their bomb bays were filled not with high explosives but with something far deadlier. M69 incendiaries, small cylinders packed with napalm gel, designed to ignite on impact and cling to whatever they touched. Each aircraft carried nearly 7 tons of them. At their head was the man who had changed everything, Major General Curtis LeMay. His orders were blunt: no formation flying, no daylight precision, no high-altitude safety. This time they would fly low, at altitudes barely above the reach of Japan's guns. They would come in waves. They would burn Tokyo to the ground. The approach at 5,000 feet. The ocean was a dark mirror beneath the bomber's wings. Pilots watched their altimeters nervously. Just one mistake, one engine flare, and they'd plunge into the sea. Radio chatter filled the intercoms, calm voices reciting coordinates, switching to silence as they crossed the Japanese coast. On radar screens in Tokyo, operators saw the first blips appear shortly after midnight. They had seen raids before, small, sporadic, and usually ineffective. But this was different. The dots multiplied across the screen like raindrops. Sirens wailed across the city, shrill and broken. By 12:08 a.m., the first wave arrived over eastern Tokyo, the working-class district of Shitamachi, dense with wooden homes and factories producing war materials. Elite aircraft, codenamed Hellbird, dropped magnesium flares to mark the target. The night turned white. Then the bombs began to fall. The fire begins. Each B-29 opened its bomb bay doors and released clusters of M69s. They scattered like glowing seeds, tumbling through the darkness before striking rooftops and alleys. When they ignited, they released 100-foot tongues of fire, sticky liquid flames that devoured everything they touched. The first fires merged within minutes. Winds from the southeast, gusting at 25 knots, fanned them into a single inferno. Flames leapt from house to house, street to street, until the entire district became a living furnace. The heat rose to over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt metal, hot enough to burn human flesh in seconds. Firefighters never stood a chance. Their pumps ran dry, their hoses burned, their uniforms caught fire as they ran. The bombers made pass after pass, each wave adding to the storm. At 1 a.m., the conflagration was out of control. By 2 a.m., the firestorm had consumed 10 square miles. The rising heat created its own weather, not a vortex of fire. Winds exceeding 100 miles per hour ripped through the streets, sucking oxygen from cellars where families had taken refuge. Those who fled to rivers found the water boiling. Thousands drowned, burned, or suffocated. Voices from the ground survivors would later recall that the night glowed like noon. One woman wrote in her diary, "The fire came like a living thing. It screamed." Children were seen running ablaze through alleys, their shadows flickering on walls before vanishing into smoke. Air raid shelters turned into ovens. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in minutes. For those in the bombers above, the sight was almost unreal. Through the plexiglass windows, gunners saw the city burning in geometric lines, blocks of flame separated by rivers of black smoke. The fire rose so high that some aircraft were lifted by the updrafts, tossed like leaves. Radio reports from the crews were brief, emotionless. Target area burning well. Visibility excellent. Secondary ignition confirmed. There was no mention of people. Only results. War reduced to statistics. The turning sky by 3 a.m., the firestorm's light was visible 150 miles away. Pilots said it looked like the sunrise had come early. But there was no dawn, only the reflection of a city dissolving into ash. From the ground, survivors saw the B-29s pass overhead as black silhouettes against the inferno, their engines droning like distant thunder. When the last bomber turned south toward the sea, Tokyo was gone. The fires would burn for another 16 hours. The ash drifted into nearby prefectures, covering crops, boats, and rivers. More than 100,000 people were dead, burned, crushed, or suffocated. Over 1 million left homeless. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history. Deadlier than Hiroshima, deadlier than Nagasaki. But for LeMay, it was only the beginning. The results were undeniable. Factories, warehouses, transport lines, gone. The imperial capital had been reduced to cinders. The enemy's will at last was trembling. As the first rays of morning broke over the Pacific, the B-29 crew saw the glow still flickering on the horizon. None spoke. They simply watched, knowing that history had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And even as the smoke of Tokyo rose into the sky, the next missions were already being planned. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. Each name another city waiting for the same fate. Because once fire had proven its power, it would not stop burning. The night Tokyo burned marked a turning point, not just in the war but in the nature of warfare itself. Curtis LeMay's gamble had worked. Where precision had failed, fire had triumphed. And in the months that followed, that same fire would sweep across Japan like a storm with no horizon. The March of Flames, within 2 weeks of the Tokyo raid, the 20th Air Force launched a relentless series of follow-up attacks. On March 13th, the target was Nagoya, Japan's center of aircraft production. On March 16th, Osaka, the industrial heart of the Kansai region. Then Kobe, Yokohama, and Nagoya again. Each night, hundreds of B-29s rose from the Marianas carrying the same mix of incendiary clusters, phosphorus and magnesium. Each night, a different city vanished into smoke. The tactics were identical. Low-altitude approach, no formation, radar-guided bombing over densely packed neighborhoods. The Japanese defense network, already crippled, barely responded. Radar operators reported hundreds of intruders, but communication lines had been shattered. By the time anti-aircraft guns opened fire, the bombers were already gone, leaving only walls of flame behind. By the end of April 1945, nearly 60 Japanese cities had been attacked. More than half of Japan's urban area had been damaged or destroyed. Steel plants, shipyards, and electrical grids were gone, but so were temples, schools, and hospitals. The line between military and civilian targets no longer existed. It had been erased by the sheer scale of destruction. The view from the bomb bay, for the crews of the B-29s. The raids became routine, a grim rhythm of loading, climbing, dropping, and returning. They grew numb to the sight of entire cities burning beneath them. What had once been shocking became procedure. But some never escaped what they saw. A gunner from the 9th Bomb Group later wrote, "It wasn't like Europe. There were no searchlights, no flak, no fighters, just fire. You could feel it even at 5,000 feet, the heat pushing up through the floor. We were supposed to look away. I couldn't." The crews called it the glow. From their altitude, the flames blurred into a single mass of orange and red, like molten glass spreading to the horizon. At times, the light was so bright that navigators had to shield their eyes to read instruments. They joked about the sunrise raids, but few laughed for long. Voices from the ashes for those on the ground, there was no joke, only survival. Cities once filled with life became blackened plains of rubble. Children carried buckets to search for water that no longer existed. Mothers searched for names among lists of the dead, printed in newspapers that barely reached the ruins. Eyewitnesses described a silence that followed each raid, not of peace, but of exhaustion. One survivor from Osaka said, "It was like the earth had stopped breathing." Another from Nagoya recalled walking through streets where the air itself seemed burned. In Tokyo, where reconstruction had barely begun, people moved among the ashes collecting melted coins, warped teapots, anything that might be sold or saved. But every new dawn brought the sound of engines again. The firestorm was not a memory. It was a cycle. The enemy's desperation, Japan's high command was collapsing under the pressure. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso resigned. Military leaders argued over whether to surrender or fight to the last man. Yet even as the war turned hopeless, the government ordered civilians to continue production. Children hammered aircraft bolts in underground tunnels. Women sewed uniforms in half-burned homes. The empire refused to die quietly. To counter the B-29s, Japan launched desperate measures. New interceptors like the Kawasaki Ki-100 and the Shinden prototype promised to challenge the bombers. But by the time they appeared, fuel shortages made regular patrols impossible. Some pilots resorted to kamikaze tactics against the bombers, suicide climbs into the formation, hoping to take one fortress down with them. Few succeeded. The B-29s kept coming. The strategic spiral. By mid-1945, the United States had achieved complete air supremacy. The 20th Air Force could strike anywhere, anytime. Factories in the Marianas operated around the clock, building new bombers faster than Japan could shoot them down. LeMay's crews flew hundreds of missions a month. Losses were minimal, often less than 2% per raid. To the planners in Washington, the campaign was a triumph of logistics. To the people of Japan, it was the end of civilization. Cities burned faster than they could be mapped. Japan's rail system collapsed under the weight of refugees. Hospitals overflowed. Corpses filled rivers and famine followed the smoke. Still, LeMay was unsatisfied. He saw the results in photographs taken after each mission. Endless rectangles of ash. But the war continued. The Japanese government had not yet surrendered. The emperor remained silent. And so the raids intensified further, the calm before the unthinkable. By June 1945, Tokyo had been hit 8 times. Osaka 6, Kobe 4. The B-29s had killed more than 300,000 civilians and left millions without homes. Yet the factories that remained underground still produced rifles, shells, and aircraft. Japan refused to yield. LeMay prepared for the final phase, the annihilation of what was left. Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan, loomed. Casualty estimates ran into the millions. The B-29s were ordered to continue softening the target, to erase Japan's ability to resist. But in the laboratories of New Mexico and the deserts of Nevada, a new weapon was being readied. A weapon that would make even fire seem merciful. The B-29 would be its delivery system. And so, as the summer of 1945 arrived, the same aircraft that had burned Tokyo to the ground began carrying something entirely new in their bomb bays, a secret so great that even most of their crews did not know what it was. Its name was Little Boy. Its mission, Hiroshima. The sky that had turned to fire was about to turn to light. When the smoke cleared over Tokyo, Japan was no longer a nation of cities. It was a nation of ruins. Entire districts existed only as charcoal outlines on aerial photographs. The fires of March 1945 had not just destroyed buildings, they had erased the rhythm of daily life itself. Trains no longer ran. Water lines were shattered. Bodies lay buried under the cinders of what had been homes, schools, and temples. The survivors moved through the wreckage in silence. They built makeshift huts from sheet metal, burned bricks, and scavenged lumber. Rice was scarce. Water was poisoned with ash. Disease spread faster than relief could arrive. Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the hearts of Japanese industry, had become blackened scars on the earth. For the Japanese government, the truth was undeniable. The empire was crumbling from within. Factories destroyed, ports closed, railways broken. The nation's industrial output fell by nearly half in a single season. Even the military command centers were being displaced from city to city. trying to escape the bombers that never stopped coming. And still, the B-29s returned. Every few days, the air raid sirens wailed again. Children no longer ran to shelters. They simply stared at the sky, too tired to move. The sound of engines had become as familiar as breathing, a sound that carried the promise of death. When the bombers left, the people emerged to count the missing. For many, there was no one left to count. Inside the Air Force back on the Marianas, General Curtis LeMay watched the reconnaissance photos with cold precision. Entire neighborhoods, once dense grids of life that were now blank spaces. To him, this meant progress. To the world, it meant something else. Some within the 20th Air Force began to question the scale of destruction. What had begun as a military campaign now resembled annihilation. But orders were orders, and for LeMay, the only acceptable outcome was surrender. He believed that every night of fire saved 1,000 lives that would otherwise be lost in invasion. He never apologized for his strategy. He called it necessity. To the crews, the missions blurred together. Some stopped marking their bomb runs on maps. Others refused to look out the windows during drops. There were rumors of airmen vomiting in flight after seeing the burning cities below. They didn't talk about it in the debriefings, only in whispers or not at all. War had made them into instruments, precise, detached, and unfeeling. But humanity lingered, quiet and heavy. It lived in the silence after the engines shut down, in the letters home that said nothing of what they'd done. Japan's breaking point by July 1945, Japan was isolated. The Imperial Navy was sunk, its merchant fleet shattered. Food shortages were catastrophic. Even the Emperor's voice, once a symbol of divine strength, had grown distant. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Military leaders still planned for a final suicidal defense of the homeland, a decisive battle that would cost millions of lives on both sides. Meanwhile, the fire raids continued. Over 800,000 tons of incendiaries were dropped across Japan's remaining cities. Each attack was smaller than Tokyo, but together they burned the nation down to its foundations. By the end of July, half of Japan's urban population was homeless. The country was dying, one ember at a time. And yet, even as the flames consumed the empire, the war's architects were preparing something beyond imagination. On the island of Tinian, the same island from which the Tokyo raid had launched, a new kind of B-29 sat under armed guard. Its bomb bay had been modified. Its crew sworn to silence. They called their mission Special Order 13. The fire that had devoured Tokyo had proven unstoppable. But the light that was coming next would be something entirely different. Something that no one, not even Curtis LeMay, could truly comprehend. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan. At 8:15 a.m., a single B-29 named Enola Gay approached the city from the southeast. Its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, flew at 31,000 feet. The mission brief was simple: deliver the first atomic bomb in history. They had practiced for months without knowing what their cargo truly was. Now in the bomb bay, the weapon called Little Boy waited, a cylinder of uranium that would end an era. When the bay doors opened, the bomb fell silently through the morning air. 43 seconds later, Hiroshima ceased to exist. A sphere of light brighter than the sun erupted at 1,800 feet, followed by a shock wave that flattened the city within seconds. Temperatures soared beyond 4,000 degrees Celsius. Tens of thousands vaporized instantly. Tens of thousands more burned in the fires that followed. The city's rivers boiled. The shadows of people were seared into walls. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second B-29 Boxcar dropped another bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. By the end of that week, more than 200,000 people were dead. The final decision in Tokyo, the Emperor's council met in despair. The empire's generals still wanted to fight. They argued that Japan could endure the bombing, could still repel an invasion, but the Emperor Hirohito had seen enough. The fire raids had gutted his cities. The atomic bombs had destroyed his hope. On August 15, 1945, his voice echoed across the radio waves, calm, trembling, divine. It was the first time his people had ever heard him speak. He did not use the word surrender. He called it enduring the unendurable. But the meaning was clear. World War II was over. Across the Pacific, B-29 crews received the news with disbelief. Some cheered. Others sat quietly in their bunks staring at the ground. The missions were finished. The planes that had once darkened the sky would now sit in silence, lined up along tropical runways, their wings gleaming in the sun. Curtis LeMay heard the Emperor's broadcast aboard his headquarters plane. He didn't smile. He simply lit a cigar and said, "We did what we had to do." For him, victory had always been measured in results, not regrets. The price of progress. When the occupation began, American survey teams entered Japan to document the damage. They found cities reduced to black dust, twisted steel, and memories. A single fact stunned them all. 66 Japanese cities had been bombed by B-29s, and more than half of Japan's total housing had been destroyed. In Tokyo alone, the firestorm had killed more people than the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The sheer scale of destruction redefined warfare itself. The B-29 had proved that a single nation, armed with technology and industry, could erase another's cities from the sky. It was both a triumph and a warning. Scientists who had built the bomb began to speak of guilt and fear. Airmen who had flown the B-29s avoided the word hero. They were instruments of strategy, not vengeance. They had done their duty. But history would never stop asking what that duty had cost. The empire in ruins post-war Japan was a wasteland of silence and rebuilding. Millions wandered through ashes that had once been neighborhoods. Mothers carried children born under skies that had burned. The Imperial Army was disbanded. Its pride dissolved under Allied occupation. But from those ruins, something extraordinary emerged. A nation determined never to burn again. Within a decade, the same factories that once built bombers' targets began to produce cars, radios, and steel. The same people who had lived under fire rebuilt cities of glass and light. The scars of war became the foundations of peace. Japan would rise, not through conquest, but through creation. And the B-29? Its legacy outlasted the war it ended. It became the blueprint for a new generation of bombers, for the Cold War's nuclear age, for the doctrine of deterrence that would define the next 50 years. It had proven that technology could make nations invincible and humanity vulnerable. The fires had burned out. The bombers had gone quiet. But the sky, once a symbol of hope, would never look the same again. Because those who had seen it turn to fire could never forget how quickly light could consume the world. The war ended, but the sky did not forget. Even decades later, survivors of Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki would still look upward with unease whenever they heard the drone of an aircraft. For them, the heavens had once turned against the earth, and the sound of engines was no longer just sound. It was memory. The B-29 superfortress began as a dream of precision, a marvel of human engineering meant to end wars faster, cleaner, smarter. But war has no clean edges. In the hands of men like Curtis LeMay, it became something else, an argument that mercy and victory could not coexist. It flew higher than any bomber before it, yet its legacy would always be measured in the ashes it left behind. The Japanese pilots who once laughed at its distant gleam could never have imagined how that silver silhouette would reshape their world. They called it untouchable, and they were right. No bullet, no zero, no wall of flak could stop it. But its true power was not its height or its range. It was the idea it carried, that the future of war would belong to the machines that reached farthest, not the men who flew them. When the fires died and the ruins cooled, a new age began. An age where nations no longer fought only for land, but for supremacy in the air, in science, and in fear. The B-29 was both a conclusion and a beginning, the closing chapter of one war and the first page of the atomic age. And so the story ends, not with victory parades or medals, but with silence. The kind of silence that lingers after the fire is gone, when the smoke fades into cloud and the world begins to count what it has lost. Above it all, the sky remains, endless, indifferent, eternal. It has seen empires rise and cities burn. It has heard the laughter of pilots and the cries of those below. And if it remembers anything, it is this: that once, for a brief and terrible moment, humanity set the heavens themselves on fire and learned too late what it meant to master the sky.